live in a decade when, for the first time in human history, more people live in cities than in the countryside. Cities are thought of as shining beacons of progress. As they grow, they draw people to them in search of prosperity, security, or a better life.
21 million people live in Mexico City. It's one of a handful of global cities that define our modern era. It's the political, cultural, and economic driver of all Mexico.
But its size is one of its biggest problems. How do you maintain order and control so many people?
But this is not a modern problem. 2,000 years ago, another metropolis dominated this part of the Americas, what we call Mesoamerica. And this ancient city grew to dominate its population and influence distant empires.
That city was called Teotihuacan. For hundreds of years, it was the biggest in the New World. Its rulers built monumental structures and then went on to build a vast empire. Yet the identity of the people who led this civilization remains a mystery. My name is Jacob Cooper. I'm a specialist in the archaeology of the Americas. In this series, I will be exploring the rise and fall of forgotten civilizations. From the crystal clear seas of the Caribbean to the New World's most impressive pyramids, over the smoking volcanoes of Costa Rica, and deep underground in the caves of central Mexico. I'll travel in the footsteps of these peoples to reveal their secrets, to unearth the astonishing cultures that flourished amongst some of the most dramatic landscapes in the world. So what lay behind the rise to power and influence of this great city of Teotihuacan?
What drove this city and its people was a powerful ideology of conquest, trade, and religion. And what I want to understand is how this once powerful civilization went up in flames.
This is the Basin of Mexico. It's a high plain valley where Mexico City lies. But just 30 miles northeast of the capital lies the remains of Teotihuacan, another great capital that grew into an enormous city-state almost 2,000 years ago. Little is known about the origins of Teotihuacan, but by 100 BC, its population could have been as high as 20,000 people. It was significant and one of many settlements in the Basin of Mexico. But within 200 years, there was a huge change. This is the Basin of Mexico in 100 AD. Teotihuacan stands out as the largest settlement in the region. So why did Teotihuacan grow so rapidly, and what happened to those other settlements? I've come almost 50 miles southwest of Teotihuacan to see what became of one settlement whose growth came to an abrupt halt.
This is all that remains of the city of Cuicuilco. It's well placed in the valley for rainfall and agriculture, and this circular temple is the first piece of monumental architecture in the Basin of Mexico. Started around 700 BC, it's completed in 400 BC. And during this time when Cuicuilco is rising to prominence, Teotihuacan is still just a provincial village.
But Cuicuilco had one major disadvantage. It lived in the shadow of the Xitle volcano. and a series of eruptions forced its people to leave, looking for somewhere safe from this danger. By 50 BC, most of the city was covered in 10 meters of lava. What happened to Cuicuilco wasn't isolated.
Elsewhere in the basin of Mexico, there's another volcano, the smoking mountain of Popocatépetl that looms menacingly over the landscape. We know that in the 1st century AD it erupted catastrophically, forcing the people to migrate, looking for a more secure future.
Volcanic activity was a major reason for the big population shift in the basin of Mexico in the 1st century AD. People were moving north, where they could be free from these violent natural forces. But those who were moving to seek safety were following in the footsteps of those who had moved in search of opportunity. Together, they had uprooted to seek out a place that might allow them to build a better life.
And there was one likely destination, a city growing fast in size and prestige, Teotihuacan. At its height around 200 AD, there were over 100,000 people living in the city. And as these migrants headed north, they became part of an unprecedented urban, cultural and economic explosion in the New World. And as they approached, they would have seen something remarkable. This is Teotihuacan, and it's enormous, covering 8 square miles. Spatially, it's all organised around 3 monumental structures. Archaeologists have discovered that these buildings were covered in bright facades with exquisite architectural motifs, all conveying an extraordinary sense of opulence.
The city then sprawls out from the centre, with palaces, temples and housing for its massive population. The city is dissected by the Avenue of the Dead, a street that runs for more than 4 kilometres north to south. The whole site is built on an orientation of 15.5 degrees east of astronomical north, possibly in alignment with the Pleiades constellation, one of the most visible clusters of stars in the night sky. The city's origins could lie underground in a cave. Caves in Mesoamerica were thought of as places of creation and emergence, so had religious significance. One cave was considered so sacred by the Teotihuacano that a structure was built on top of it to mark its significance.
This is the Pyramid of the Sun. It's the largest structure in Teotihuacan and the most impressive pyramid in the New World.
Even without the wooden temple that would have stood on its top platform, it's still over 200 feet tall. It faces west towards the setting sun and is the focal point of the entire site. But it doesn't stand alone. At the end of the Great Avenue of the Dead is the Pyramid of the Moon. It may have been built in honor of the god Tlaloc, the bringer of rain and fertility, which may also be the reason why it mimics the shape of Cerro Gordo, the sacred mountain which lies behind it, and whose springs provided the city with its water.
It's not just the scale that's impressive, it's the order, because you can't help but feel small standing in its midst. For For the people living in this city, these structures must have made them feel privileged. But why was architecture on this scale undertaken?
Saburo Sugiyama has led numerous excavations at Teotihuacan and has been trying to discover what lay behind this city's construction.
We don't know really very much about the early stage of Teotihuacan formation. But this city was created as a planned city from the very beginning. If you look at this, the scale of the city formations, we have to propose that there's a very organized political structures here. Otherwise, you can't control 100,000 people. There must have been very strong political organizations.
So to what extent do you think that the architectural layout here reflects a level of rulership or a level of control at the site?
I think that there was a very strong rulers, perhaps charismatic rulers who created, who invented new worldviews. And they materialized these ideas, how world consisted, how we were created with God, with suns, moons, and other stars. All these movements, it's a kind of the interpretations of worldviews.
These new worldviews formed the religion that the rulers used to control Teotihuacan. The beliefs were incorporated into the very foundations of the city. The measurements that dictated the dimensions of their buildings were embedded in their religion and in their physical bodies.
Teotihuacan had a standard unit of measurement, which was exactly 83 centimetres long. And it's thought the origins of this unit of measurement came from the median line of the chest out to the edge of the fingers of your average Teotihuacano. And what's amazing is that the entire urban plan of Teotihuacan is planned out using this standard unit of measurement. So if we look at the base of the Pyramid of the Sun, it's exactly 260 times 83. And 260 represents the ritual calendar of Teotihuacan. And if we look at the Pyramid of the Moon, the base is exactly 105 times 83 centimetres. And if we add 105 to 260, we get 365, the annual solar calendar.
The 260-day ritual calendar at Teotihuacan was most likely based around significant religious events. That it formed the dimensions of the Pyramid of the Sun underlined the link between the construction of the city and its belief system. But the belief system was not just reflected in the buildings. Throughout the city, there is extraordinary artwork that aim to bind a people together through religion. David Caraballo guided me through one of Teotihuacan's most distinctive and important murals.
It seems like this is more than just artistic representation for decoration. This is telling a story.
It seems to be a Teotihuacano projection of what might seem like a paradise, of this place of plenty and abundance. We have to remember, of course, we're in a semi-arid environment with a really defined wet and dry cycle. And so, this sort of watery paradise would be very appealing, as that the state leaders were keeping the rains coming, courtesy of the storm god up here, and keeping good harvests. So we see these flowing canals that are feeding agricultural fields that have crops that we can possibly identify like maize, but also flowering plants that are being harvested. And so this is a scene of abundance and prosperity. One thing to really focus on here is that the emphasis is on the religious system and not on individuals. So You know, there are individuals here, but they're subordinate to the storm god who flanks them all around. And then this motif up here, which is larger, where there's two personages, but they're virtually identical, and they're priests, and they're dutifully making offerings to the central personage, who's debated. Some believe that it's a female image, a goddess, and I think the state imagery seems to be conveying over and over again this message of the religious system matters, these deities matter, attending to them matters. Individual roles do not matter. Your social roles as a priest or a warrior are what's critical to the society. We can't pinpoint one individual ruler in this whole corpus of mural art for the city.
It may offer no clue as to the identity of the rulers, but the mural is preaching their religious message. If the people followed, then all would be well in Teotihuacan. But ensuring the well-being of Teotihuacan required more than just religious observation from the people. One violent public ritual appeased the gods while demonstrating the power of the leaders and the strength of their belief system: human sacrifice. In the year 2000, archaeologists were excavating inside the Pyramid of the Moon. And what they found inside was a series of different burials. This little collection here comes from burial number 4, which was 17 skulls found collected together without the rest of the skeleton. What's interesting about these skulls is that they were all found with 3 cervical vertebrae, which tells us that the human skull was fleshed when they were deposited, because otherwise the cervical vertebrae would have fallen off. If you look here, you can see cut marks on the back of the vertebrae. The way that we think these people were killed was with a hard blow to the back of the head. But it's clear from the way this is being cut is that they didn't get removed in one blow, but there's been a sawing process coming through here to help remove the head. What's interesting though is that if we look at the mandible, at the jawbone, and you can see it would normally be in this position on the jaw, but underneath the jaw, just in here, you can see a cut mark coming in, which is coming from the other direction. So we're seeing a heavy blow on the back, a sawing process as the head is cut from behind, but also a blade, a very sharp blade, judging by these cut marks, coming in from the front to remove the head. So we're seeing a laborious process to remove these heads from the body. And it gives us a sense that these are definitely people having their heads removed, specifically for the object of placing them in some sort of ceremony within the heart of the Pyramid of the Moon. These skulls could have been dedications to the construction of the Pyramid of the Moon. But sacrifice was also used as a political tool to control the city's diverse population. But the religious compliance of the people depended upon their everyday needs being met. And in a city this size, that required a huge amount of resources. Even though Teotihuacan was the dominant power in the Basin of Mexico by the 3rd century AD, it needed more than local resources to sustain its population. It had to expand. I need to drive 50 miles north to the state of Hidalgo to begin to understand how Teotihuacan expanded into an empire using trade. And how, when it came to precious resources, it had one big advantage.
It had access to an abundant source of one of the most valuable commodities of the time. It was this, obsidian, or volcanic glass. It can be styled into artifacts, but most importantly, fashioned into the sharpest cutting tools in Mesoamerica.
At the time of Teotihuacan's rise, metal wasn't worked in Mesoamerica, so obsidian was an essential item for everyday tasks. Because of its value, the supply of obsidian was controlled by the state, not just for its use in the city, but for trade. I've got the opportunity to explore an ancient obsidian mine that is still worked today. In 2,000 years, almost nothing has changed. You can still see old mine shafts, as well as the burn marks from Teotihuacan torches. They're claustrophobic and remain extremely hazardous.
Mining in this type of soil is very dangerous because it's very loose and you can see how easily you can get collapses of tunnels. So I'm sure that in these tunnels which have been blocked up, the pre-Hispanic tunnels, there must be skeletons underneath from cave collapses.
Okay, y aquí.
Alejandro Pastrana is an expert in the importance of obsidian to Mesoamerican cultures and has been studying the mines in this area for over 20 years.
Y como puedes ver, aquí obsidiana de un color
qué bonito.
y aquí de otro.
Sí, sí, completamente diferentes colores.
Toda esta.
Sí, sí.
Y aquí puedes ver el color.
Ah, sí. Sí, pero es casi vidrio, ¿no?
Exacto, es
Sí.
vidrio.
Parecido a un vidrio de vino, una botella de vino.
Ajá.
Que tiene este color de verde.
Y hasta donde yo sé, este color
Sí.
y el dorado es único en el mundo.
Sí, sí, sí.
This unique green obsidian was prized for its high quality, but also its religious significance. Throughout Mesoamerica, green was a colour associated with fertility and with water. Even though these miners worked a considerable distance from the city, Teotihuacan's religion transformed their manual labour into a symbolic act.
La obsidiana, en general, los minerales para los mineros son seres vivos. Y si el minero no es bueno, se esconde. Entonces necesita ser un buen minero, necesita ser un minero religioso para que aparezca el mineral y puedas encontrarlo. Que en el mundo prehispánico todo se ve a través de la religión. Un minero está adentro de las entrañas de la tierra. Un minero es un intruso que está rompiendo un tiempo sagrado y un espacio sagrado.
As well as the constant threat of collapse, miners only had torchlight and stone tools to dig for the obsidian that supplied Teotihuacan with its only cutting tools.
So this is a block of really high quality obsidian. You can see on the one on the wall that the pressure of being underground has fractured this block of obsidian. But this one is clean and you could make some absolutely lovely artifacts, particularly knife blades.
The obsidian blocks could weigh anything up to 500 kilos and would have been broken down by hand into more manageable chunks. After being carried to the surface, the obsidian then entered the next phase of production.
The obsidian mines are just over that hill, and here we have a Teotihuacan workshop. This is where the obsidian blocks being brought out of the mines would have been transformed into preforms and artifacts. And what's particularly interesting about this workshop is that it's laid out in exactly the same orientation as the city of Teotihuacan itself.
The obsidian was knapped to create blades and artifacts. Knapping is an ancient and unique skill that transformed stones into tools and takes a lifetime to perfect.
El sonido es muy importante.
Sí. Porque el sonido da la idea de la densidad del bloque, la densidad
de la calidad. Sí, entonces, por ejemplo,
estupendo.
aquí no suena sólido. ¿Hay algún problema?
Sí.
Acá suena mejor de este lado.
Sí. Ah, bonita. Esta es muy
tiene
bonita.
Buena calidad.
Sí, pero esta es muy bonita porque tiene la perspectiva de una navaja Teotihuacán, ¿no? Porque ellos tienen mucho más fino que ellos tienen, que vienen en esta forma. Cuando
¿Puedes probar el filo?
Sí, pero está aquí. Sí, no, sí, te vas primero, es como muy fino, ¿no?
Pero el filo lo pierde muy rápido.
Sí.
Por eso necesitaban mucha obsidiana, mucha obsidiana. Más afuera, golpear más afuera. Un poquito más afuera, estás golpeando adentro.
Sí.
Ahí está.
¡Qué bueno! And here's the flake, and you can see it. It's a beautiful, translucent obsidian. And you can see where the percussions hit down, the fracture marks come down, and it creates a perfect blade. And this edge is incredibly sharp.
These razor-sharp blades were used for more than just domestic cutting tools. The obsidian mines and workshops were worked continuously to supply Teotihuacan with weapons. Thousands of obsidian blades were needed for Teotihuacan's forces, the largest army in Mesoamerica. Marco Cervera is an archaeologist who is going to show me the Teotihuacan's weapons of choice.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
The atlatl is one half of a weapon. The other half is an obsidian-tipped dart. In the right hands, the atlatl can launch the dart more than 100 meters in all weathers.
So we've hung up a leg of beef in order to simulate human flesh, because I'm quite interested to find out how the technology of the armaments of Teotihuacan gave them a tactical advantage in war. Esto es.
Y
Llegó.
llegó. Ahora
Sí.
sí hay que
Y
ir a
veo
ver.
que
y
adentro, sí.
Vamos a platicar ahora sí. No,
Y ese
puta,
es con
pero
el-
penetró
Sí, y ese es
duro,
con el punto de obsidiana, se pueden ir adentro. Y también tiene este estilo del obsidiana que pueden ir adentro, ¿no?
Exactamente. Y aquí evidentemente se ve, sí está filmando, evidentemente se ve la capacidad de penetración y que obviamente esto es letal.
So the atlatl is a piece of technology which has been around in Mesoamerica for thousands of years, going right back to the Lithic Age. But what the Teotihuacan did was put it into an industrial scale. If you can imagine an army of 10, 15,000 people throwing these atlatls, it would have been like a rain of darts landing on the opposition army.
So where and when was this fighting force deployed? It was used primarily to achieve the goals of the state, and those goals were economic. Teotihuacan had an extensive network of trade routes. The bulk of the activity was carried out in what is called the Teotihuacan Corridor. Regions that were rich in resources were targeted.
I'm heading to the site of Las Pilas in the state of Morelos. It's over 100 miles southwest of Teotihuacan, which is a considerable distance when you imagine that the only form of transportation is on foot. But Teotihuacan didn't want to just trade resources, they wanted to control them.
This is Las Pilas. It was a small settlement that came under the direct control of Teotihuacan. Their presence can be seen throughout the site. The structures copy a Teotihuacan architectural style called talud tablero, a platform on top of a sloping base. The layout of the buildings is similar to those back in the capital, with a common platform linking enclosed plazas. Below ground, archaeologists found more evidence of Teotihuacan's influence.
Burials excavated in this central plaza contained extensive evidence of Teotihuacan-style ceramics. In several instances, individuals were found with offerings of over 100 vessels of both imported and local wares.
There was a strong reason for this heavy Teotihuacan presence at Las Pilas: to ensure large quantities of a precious crop that couldn't be cultivated in the basin of Mexico.
The climate around Teotihuacan wasn't hot enough to grow this, cotton. And the Teotihuacano needed a lot of cotton to spin it for their clothes, their vibrant textiles, even the armour fibre they used in war. So they needed to guarantee a reliable supply.
Because of its size, Las Pilas would have offered little resistance to such a powerful force. Local people would have been used to work the land to ensure enough cotton was produced to satisfy the demand back at the centre. But the demand for raw materials was only going to increase.
As Teotihuacan got bigger, it needed more resources. Existing trade routes were maintained to sustain the power and wealth of the city, but new areas had to be explored. They sent out people to conquer and exploit new territories.
I'm driving 300 miles southeast to the Oaxaca Valley, which was the stronghold of another ancient civilization, the Zapotecs. There had long been peaceful contact between the two civilizations, but around 250 AD, Teotihuacan's insatiable demand for resources brought that relationship to an end.
This is Monte Alban, the hilltop citadel of the Zapotecs. From this vantage point, the Zapotecs could rule over the valleys around, or at least until the forces of Teotihuacan arrived.
Hundreds of well-armed warriors had marched on Monte Alban, prepared for conflict. By the time they isolated the Zapotec elite on top of the city's north platform, the battle was already won.
70 of these were found at the top mound of the site. They're obsidian, and they're different types of obsidian coming from the mines of the central highlands of Mexico. So these come from the area of Teotihuacan. You can't find obsidian in this part of Mexico. Many of these points, probably used as atlatl points, have broken off at the tips and snapped off on the shaft, which tells us that they've been broken on impact. So this tells me that the contact between Teotihuacan and Monte Alban is a violent one.
The violence continued after the conflict. In the wake of their victory, the new rulers of Monte Alban sacrificed 18 children. All this bloodshed was over a resource that the Zapotecs didn't even use, but was coveted by Teotihuacan. A fragile and delicate mineral called mica. The Teotihuacan prized its translucent and reflective qualities and used it to decorate their religious buildings and ceramics. I met up with Marcus Winter to discover what were the factors really driving this aggression.
Do you think that the Teotihuacano are expanding for practical reasons, that they need to bring in more resources to sustain their expansion? Or do you see it as being more ideological, that they're trying to dominate their ideological worldview on the rest of Mesoamerica?
I'd say that they wanted to expand to bring in more resources. I think as the cities grow all over the world, what happens is they have too many people. They need more resources to feed the people. They need more activities for people to participate in. Sometimes they have too many young men with nothing to do, and a good thing to do with them is send them out and take over other areas.
How do you think life changed here when the Teotihuacano were in control? Do you see a thriving community which is capitalising on Teotihuacano innovations, or do you see a repressed population who are suffering from a dominating force overcoming them?
I'd say it was a repressed population.
Yeah.
Because a lot of things stopped. There was a trajectory that had gone on for about 500 years or more, 700 years of growth and development, renewal of the buildings, and all of that stopped. There was still a big population, and people lived and continued with their daily lives and things, but there was not the growth and innovation that had been here previously.
Teotihuacan's imperial adventures were at the expense of cities like Monte Alban. But the drive for resources and expansion didn't stop here.
This site of Monte Alban shows how the Teotihuacan were able to control regions over 350 miles from the capital. But what's even more incredible is that their influence spread yet further. We know that at sites like Tikal, over 600 miles in that direction in modern-day Guatemala, also felt the influence and power of Teotihuacan.
The rulers of Teotihuacan had developed a strong religion that allowed them first to govern a city and now to control an empire. The economic benefits of trade and empire were enriching the city, but they were also strengthening the position of the rulers. As an illustration of how this increased power was expressed, the last monumental structure built at Teotihuacan is significant, and one building within it is of crucial importance.
It stood at the centre of this massive 16-hectare walled compound called the Ciudadela, the citadel. The whole population would have been able to fit within its grounds.
The people of Teotihuacan would have come to this space to witness religious rituals at the building that was now the new ceremonial heart of the city. The building was completed in the middle of the 3rd century and stands remote from the pyramids of the Sun and Moon. Archaeologists believe that this construction was a conspicuous display of power by a new ruler in Teotihuacan.
This is the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, a mythical creature found throughout Mesoamerica. It's a potent symbol of power, and that's important because this temple provides strong evidence that an increasing power of an elite is administered through religion but maintained through fear.
The whole temple structure is a sacred mountain emerging from the sea. These crocodile heads marked the beginning of time. Time began when the crocodile emerged from the water onto dry land. The feathered serpents represent the power of the rulers. These rulers now appeared to be directly linking their power to the beginning of time. But that power was not just reinforced by the grand ornamentation of a building. If anything pointed to a change in the nature of the leadership of Teotihuacan, it was the escalation in human sacrifice. 260 victims were found during excavations of this temple. One for each day of the ritual calendar, and hundreds more than any human remains excavated from the earlier pyramids. Sergio Gomez was involved in the excavations at the Temple of the Feathered Serpent that unearthed human remains.
¿Por qué piensan que están haciendo esos sacrificios? ¿Qué es el vínculo entre el simbolismo y el sacrificio?
El sacrificio humano en Teotihuacán fue algo muy importante. Sabemos que el sacrificio fue parte de la vida cotidiana. El sacrificio humano fue parte de la vida cotidiana de una sociedad eminentemente religiosa. Son eventos que se refieren al poder, porque implica que alguien es casi dueño de tu vida y puede disponer de ella. Pero esto es parte de la estructura de poder enmascarado por la cuestión religiosa.
¿Quién son los individuos que están sacrificados? ¿Están parte de esta gente de Teotihuacán o vienen de otra parte de la región?
Hay todavía discusión. Es probable que muchos sean una especie de cautivos o miembros de alto estatus de otros lugares que fueron traídos a Teotihuacán para hacer este sacrificio. E incluso hay la sospecha de que algunos pudieran ser individuos de lugares muy lejanos, pero no se sabe con certeza de dónde venían. Tampoco se sabe exactamente cómo es que fueron colocados. Están con las manos atadas atrás, pero colocar a 260 individuos debió haber sido un acto muy especial.
But what archaeologists know is that after the temple was completed, perhaps around 300 AD, there was another change in Teotihuacan. A large structure was built in front of the temple, obscuring its opulent facade. Could it have been a rejection of the power structure that the temple represented? Without knowing more about those who wielded the power in Teotihuacan, archaeologists have struggled to understand the full significance of the changes centered around the Temple of the Feathered Serpent. But Sergio Gomez may be on the verge of a major breakthrough. In 2003, he discovered a tunnel underneath the temple. It had lain undetected for over 1,000 years because Sergio believes it had been filled in deliberately by the Teotihuacano. His initial excavation pointed to this being a very special place.
Pero increíblemente todo el techo, las paredes y el piso estaba recubierto con un polvo de mineral metálico, como polvo de metal, todo. Entonces cuando tú entrabas aquí seguramente se iluminaba y parecía que estabas viendo las estrellas o que caminabas sobre agua.
Y con la reflexión del agua también, tiene toda esa reflexión de las estrellas que tiene arriba.
Debe haber sido increíble.
After years of painstaking excavation, Sergio and his team have reached the end of this tunnel. They could be on the verge of a unique discovery, but they face a massive obstacle.
Hay una enorme roca, como de 1,5 metros, en el centro de las 3 cámaras que están al final. Una roca que no es de ahí, la metieron. Tenemos la sospecha de que pueda ser la tapa de algo que está abajo. Pero necesitamos todavía explorar y avanzar.
¿Pero en qué manera vas a mover esta roca? Porque es un espacio tan pequeño.
Es un espacio muy pequeño y es de muchas toneladas de piedra. No sabemos qué es, estamos explorando. Pero en las paredes del mismo túnel se ven las huellas de la cuerda con la que estuvieron jalando desde adentro para meter esta roca.
What lies behind this rock could be a first for archaeology at Teotihuacan, the discovery of a ruler's tomb. This is backed up by what Sergio has found among the 60,000 artifacts unearthed during the excavation.
Algunos objetos parece que eran como bastones. Probablemente se trate como los bastones de mando. Y esto cada vez va reforzando más nuestra idea de que en este túnel pudieron haber sepultado a alguien muy, muy importante, a la gente del poder. Si nosotros logramos descubrir, corroborar la hipótesis de que hay algunas personas dentro, vamos a poder entender mucho acerca del sistema de gobierno, de cómo se estructura el poder, cómo se suceden los gobernantes.
Pero realmente es un momento de Howard Carter y Tutankamón, ¿no? Porque completamente lo mismo. Estás mirando al túnel y tienes la oportunidad para encontrar algo de esta significación, ¿no? Porque pueden cambiar el punto de visión de poder.
Esto no lo hizo cualquier gente, hay una estructura, hay un poder muy grande que ordena construir esto y después ordena clausurarlo.
Without a shadow of a doubt, this is one of the most amazing excavations that I've ever visited. Hopefully, when they get into the last chamber, what they find inside will give us the crucial clues to understanding what happened at Teotihuacan in the 3rd century after Christ, because we know there's a complete shift in power in the city.
Sealing off this tunnel and filling in a possible ruler's tomb are symbolic acts. It's impossible to say outright if they were rejections of the existing power structure. But what we do know is that there is no subsequent evidence of sacrifice on the scale witnessed at the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, nor are there any more monumental structures built after its completion. Building did continue, but it was a departure from the past. It was no longer structures that honoured the power of the leaders, but something that could point to a cultural and political peak. the state was now rebuilding the city to house its population in a style and scale that had never been witnessed before.
This is urban planning on an unprecedented scale. The old adobe structures were torn down and replaced with these, buildings of stone, concrete and plaster. But what's really interesting is that the architectural style is uniform throughout the city.
There was access to running water, a drainage system. All the compounds were walled to give the people their privacy. Outside there were streets. And for the first time in Mesoamerica, the entire city was now a huge grid. I met up again with David Carballo to see one of the best remaining examples of Teotihuacan housing.
What makes it residential? I mean, if you look around the architecture of the place, what is it that we're actually looking at?
Yeah, so, I mean, a typical pattern in central Mexico and other parts of Mesoamerica are folks inhabiting a patio. In fact, a lot of the indigenous terms for a household are a shared patio space. And so over here we have a relatively large one with nicely made masonry architecture. And so one of the lines of evidence that this is a higher status residence is that you have these large cut blocks.
So these are original stairs then?
Yes, yeah. These would be the original stairs that went up to some sort of temple complex. And then these smaller structures around that have a frontal portico leading to a back room were likely residences of higher status family members.
How many of these are there in Teotihuacan and how does that population grow?
Yeah, it's estimated that there's about 2,300 of these, and that each sort of a mean population might have been in the 60s, 65. You have some that could push into the hundreds and some that seem smaller in the dozens of people. And so because of that, because we can actually count the apartment compounds and estimate roughly their population, we do have some decent estimates for the city as a whole during its apex, and that it was 100,000 plus inhabitants in the 4th to 5th century. And just for comparison, London didn't break 100,000 people till 1,000 years later in the late 16th century. So this was a very large place, likely the largest city in the Americas for a few centuries.
To what extent do you think that the expansion is planned by an elite? Because, I mean, looking after 100,000 people in one centre is a pretty challenging thing to do.
I think that there must be some sort of mix of civic top-down planning and more grassroots organic processes happening at the neighborhood level. So, we do see that these structures are all on a similar orthogonal or grid-like system, and they seem, as far away as 3 kilometers from here to also be hewing to that orientation. So that seems to suggest some significant planning.
This house building may have reflected the growing prosperity of the city, but it could also be an example of how the style of leadership had changed. If there was a rejection of rule by violent coercion, then it may have been replaced by a subtle but still effective message that encouraged the population to think as one.
It's been referred to as civic pride, and it was sold as a virtue. And if widely accepted, it's a far more effective way of maintaining stability than the use of force. It's not very different to how we survive in the modern world today. So the supply of housing in Teotihuacan could have encouraged this sense of collective will, all working towards the same common goal.
But how was a political message as subtle as civic pride spread throughout the population? A discovery in the 1990s could be evidence of how these political messages were spread throughout Teotihuacan. Archaeologists had no evidence of a Teotihuacan writing system until a series of symbols were uncovered on the floor of a temple complex called La Ventilla. They have been dated to the middle of the 4th century AD, and Ruben Cabrera Castro thinks they may have been part of an education system.
Unos consideramos que era un centro de enseñanza.
Sí.
Aquí se enseñaba a los seminaristas o a los estudiantes o a futuros sacerdotes la ideología del Estado teotihuacano.
Sí.
Para después difundir el conocimiento a la población. debe tener mucha relación. No, no sabemos exactamente, pero debe tener, todos deben tener una relación continua. Pero no, no se puede, no sabemos si se lee en esta forma, pero sí hay temas. Por ejemplo, el jaguar te está hablando del gobernante.
Sí.
Estas bolsas de sacerdotes te está hablando de los sacerdotes. Y en muchos otros casos tenemos a Tlaloc, el dios del Estado, porque Teotihuacán tuvo muchas deidades, pero la deidad del Estado es Tlaloc, y Tlaloc se encuentra aquí en diferentes lugares.
The placing of the glyphs were first thought to be random, but Rubin thinks the horizontal and vertical lines on the floor could be ordering these symbols into the pages of a codex, an ancient book.
Decía que como los códices, en los códices están también reticulados. Entonces, tal vez para separar frases o oraciones o disposiciones muy diferentes, pero a la vez ligados. Pero de esto todavía no tenemos seguridad.
Pero esto da la idea de gramática entre una lengua, que es un paso de desarrollar la cultura bien fuerte que puede ampliar nuestra sabiduría de Teotihuacán.
Sí.
¿Y eso es arqueológico, esta pintura?
Eso es arqueológico. Por eso decía que a lo mejor los estudiantes aquí les enseñaban y se le cayó el tintero.
Sí. These glyphs with the lines dividing them that Rubin's shown me, I'm completely convinced by his argument that they are a codex. They're very much a form of writing that can communicate information between generations. If we start to think about Teotihuacan as a multi-ethnic, multicultural city, how is it that that culture is bound together by an ideology? For me, writing is crucial for communicating information through generations and binding Teotihuacan together.
A possible education and writing system are evidence of how Teotihuacan had become a politically complex civilization. And it underlines why in 500 years it had grown from unspectacular beginnings to the biggest city in the New World. It had grown through strong leadership driven by religious ideology. And its empire was built on trade, but secured through force.
Every society reaches a peak, what would normally be called an apex, something to be celebrated as a high watermark of political and cultural achievement. But it's also the point in which culture can rise no further.
At what point would Teotihuacan's expansion stop? Given its size and its power, what could possibly stop it? A city of this size was costly to maintain, and there were constant stresses in preserving its prestige. The religious system served to support the city's power structure, as well as subdue any possible threat to the leadership. Teotihuacan's empire had to be protected to secure the resources that fed its people and enriched the elite. But the leadership itself could only survive as long as the city thrived. It's a cruel irony that the very natural forces that gave Teotihuacan an advantage in its rise to power could now be responsible for triggering its demise.
In 536 AD, there was a moment of sudden environmental change in the basin of Mexico. Exciting new research suggests that this could have been a key factor in pushing the Teotihuacano to the brink of disaster. It was the biggest volcanic eruption ever recorded in Central America.
The Ilopango volcano was in modern-day El Salvador. Even though it was almost 800 miles away, the ash and gas that spewed out from the eruption clouded the skies over Teotihuacan. With no heat and light from the sun, the crops failed repeatedly, which had grave consequences for the leaders.
The stability of Teotihuacan relied on its people perceiving that their needs were being met. If there was a downturn in their fortunes, the next chapter in this city would be violent.
In the middle of the 6th century AD, the people of Teotihuacan rose up. They targeted the symbolic heart of the city and set it alight. David Carballo was part of the team that retrieved charred remains of the wooden temple structures that lined the Avenue of the Dead.
Burnt roof structures gives this sense of drama, of like things on fire and ending in quite a dramatic way. I mean, do you think that's true?
Certainly for the central part of the city. It seems like very selective, concerted burning within temples and palace complexes all around the Street of the Dead.
That whole street then would have been on fire at the same time, you imagine?
Perhaps, yeah. It seems like a planned burning event that was a symbolic termination of the civic architecture of the city.
What do you think brings about, what motivates people to come and bring up arms and take against the elite?
There must have been something in the system that was failing people. And so whether that's that the city became more factionalized and there's more internal squabbling, also that trade routes seemed to be co-opted by areas that were former provinces and that were formerly under the sway of the state. And so people here in the center perhaps weren't having the ready access they once had to all sorts of goods around Mexico.
Do you think the decline of Teotihuacan was inevitable because of the way that the state rose up over time?
We have to consider Teotihuacan a successful state in that it survived for 5 to 6 centuries as possibly the largest place in the Americas and one of the largest cities. But there certainly were some challenges in the 6th century that the governing apparatus seems to not have been able to overcome. And so what exactly it was that they couldn't evolve to is still a question to be answered.
In the wake of the revolt, the state system collapsed. The religious ideology that had bound the people together had been rejected. First to leave were the elite, whose power structure had been attacked. A population of 100,000 eventually dwindled to 20,000 people. The might of Teotihuacan existed in the past. It would take hundreds of years for the significance of this city to be rediscovered by another great civilization. When the Aztecs discovered this vast abandoned city, they believed it could only have been the work of giants, even gods. When they arrived, it had no name. They called it Teotihuacan, the place where time began. And now, almost 2,000 years since this city was built, it's still immensely significant. An ancient place that for me echoes the concerns our urban world still struggles with today.
Teotihuacan is an extraordinary city, and revealing some of its secrets, getting to know its inhabitants, has transformed my understanding of urban life. Architecture, people and power come together to create a new type of culture, a fragile urban culture that sets the new world on a pathway that is to last thousands of years.
A chance encounter sets a pair of friends on a journey that could change their lives forever here on BBC4 tonight. Another chance to catch part 1 of Detectorists at 5 to 11. After we pay a visit to an ancient monument closer to home, to Stonehenge with Time Watch next.